The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside the dusty town of Redemption, Montana Territory, in the scorching summer of 1876, and Catherine Montgomery pressed her trembling hand against the wooden door, knowing that stepping outside meant facing a future she had never imagined for herself. The advertisement had been clear enough. A rancher seeking a wife. No experience necessary, but as she gathered her worn carpetbag and descended onto the sun-baked street, the full weight of what she had agreed to settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was 22 years old, orphaned after a fever took her parents in Boston 6 months prior, and the only option left to her had been answering matrimonial advertisements or accepting a position as a housemaid to a family who had made their intentions toward her uncomfortably clear. The main street of Redemption stretched before her, lined with weathered wooden buildings that seemed to sag under the relentless Montana sun. A saloon stood on one corner, its painted sign faded and peeling, while across the way, a general store displayed bolts of fabric and farming equipment in its dusty windows. Catherine smoothed down her dark blue traveling dress, aware of how out of place she must look with her proper Boston attire and carefully pinned hair. Men in worn denim and dusty hats paused in their activities to stare at her, and she felt her cheeks burn under their scrutiny. "Miss Montgomery?" a voice called out, deep and cautious, and Catherine turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the livery stable. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his faded shirt and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days squinting across open ranges. He couldn't have been much older than 27 or 28, and there was something gentle in his expression despite the obvious strength in his frame. "I'm James Holloway. We've been corresponding." Catherine's throat went dry as she nodded, clutching her carpetbag tighter. This was the man she had agreed to marry, the stranger whose letters had been kind but formal, describing his ranch and his need for a partner but revealing little of himself. Up close, he seemed even more imposing, though his eyes held a warmth that contradicted his size. "Mr. Holloway," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes, I'm Catherine Montgomery. Thank you for meeting me." James removed his hat, revealing more of his dark hair, damp with sweat at the temples. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. It's a long way from Boston to Montana Territory." He gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby, pulled by 2 sturdy horses. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I thought perhaps you might want to get some refreshment first, or we could head out before it gets any hotter." "I would prefer to see the ranch, if that's acceptable," Catherine said, surprising herself with her directness. But the truth was she wanted to understand what her new life would look like before committing herself any further. The ceremony could wait until she had at least seen the place where she would be expected to live. Something flickered in James's eyes, perhaps approval or relief. "That makes sense. Let me take your bag." He reached for her carpetbag, and his fingers brushed hers briefly, rough and calloused against her softer skin. Catherine released the bag and followed him to the wagon, accepting his hand as he helped her up onto the wooden seat. The touch was brief but steady, and she found herself studying his profile as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. They rode in silence for the first few minutes, leaving Redemption behind and heading into the vast expanse of Montana grassland. The landscape rolled out in waves of golden prairie grass, broken occasionally by clusters of pine trees and rocky outcroppings. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Catherine had never seen anything like it. The sheer openness of it all, the way the sky seemed to stretch forever in every direction. In Boston, buildings had hemmed her in, streets had been crowded with people and carriages. Here there was nothing but land and sky and the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves. "It's beautiful," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I've never seen so much open space." James glanced at her, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "It can be overwhelming at first, or lonely, but I've always found it peaceful." He paused, seeming to consider his words. Miss Montgomery, I want you to know that I understand this situation is unusual. You don't know me, and I don't know you, not really. The arrangement we've made, it's practical, but I don't expect you to feel comfortable right away. Catherine turned to look at him more fully. That's kind of you to say. I admit I've been nervous about this, about all of it. I answered your advertisement because I had few other options, but I want to be honest with you. I don't know how to run a ranch house. I don't know how to cook for farm hands or preserve food or any of the things a rancher's wife would need to know. In Boston, we had a small household, and my mother handled most of the domestic affairs. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. But James didn't look disappointed or angry. Instead, he slowed the horses and turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. Miss Montgomery, can I be honest with you as well? When she nodded, he continued, I'm not looking for someone who already knows how to do everything. I'm looking for someone willing to build a life together. My mother passed away when I was 15, and my father followed her 3 years ago. I've been running this ranch mostly by myself since then, with help from a few hands during cattle drives and branding season. I can handle the ranch work, but the truth is I'm lonely. I'm tired of coming home to an empty house and eating meals by myself. I'm tired of having no one to talk to about anything beyond cattle prices and weather patterns. He paused, and Catherine saw something vulnerable in his eyes. I don't expect you to know how to be a wife any more than I know how to be a good husband, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are. We can learn together every day until it feels natural instead of strange. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a easing of the tight anxiety that had gripped her since she left Boston. We'll learn together every day, she repeated softly. That sounds almost bearable when you put it that way. Just bearable? James asked, and there was a hint of humor in his voice that made her smile despite her nervousness. Perhaps more than bearable, she amended. Perhaps even hopeful. They continued riding, and James began pointing out landmarks, a creek that ran through his property, the boundary where his land met his neighbor's, a stand of cottonwoods where eagles nested in the spring. He told her about the cattle, a herd of about 200 head that grazed across several hundred acres, and the horses he was starting to breed, focusing on sturdy animals that could handle the harsh Montana winters and the demanding work of ranch life. Do you ride? He asked, and Catherine shook her head. I've been in a carriage many times, but I've never actually ridden a horse myself. Is that something I'll need to learn? It would be helpful, James said. The ranch is spread out, and sometimes the quickest way to get somewhere is on horseback. But we can start slow. I've got a gentle mare named Daisy who's patient with beginners. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, and Catherine caught her breath. The house was larger than she had expected, a solid 2-story structure made of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a stable, what looked like a bunkhouse, and several smaller sheds. A vegetable garden, currently looking rather neglected, sat near the house, and beyond everything cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. It needs work, James said, and Catherine could hear the defensiveness in his voice. I've focused more on keeping the ranch running than on the house itself, but the structure is sound, and there's room for a family if that's something you'd want eventually. Catherine felt her cheeks warm at the implication, but she kept her voice steady. It's lovely, truly. Much more substantial than I expected. James helped her down from the wagon, and this time his hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. Let me show you inside. The house was indeed solid, though clearly lacking a woman's touch. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table surrounded by chairs in the center. Cabinets lined the walls, and Catherine could see dishes and supplies stacked somewhat haphazardly on the shelves. A parlor opened off to one side, sparsely furnished with a worn sofa and 2 chairs, and stairs led up to the second floor. 3 bedrooms upstairs, James said, climbing the stairs and gesturing for her to follow. The main bedroom here, 2 smaller ones there. I've been using the main one, but I can move my things if you'd prefer to have it. Or, he hesitated. Well, we can discuss the sleeping arrangements. I don't want you to feel pressured about anything. Catherine walked into the main bedroom, taking in the simple furniture, a large bed with a plain quilt, a dresser, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher. A window looked out over the prairie, and she could see the sun beginning its descent toward the mountains. I appreciate your consideration, she said quietly. But Mr. Holloway, we came to an arrangement. You sent for a wife, not a housekeeper. I understand what that means. James moved to stand beside her at the window. James, he said, please call me James. And what I'm saying is that we can take our time with all of this, the ceremony, the other aspects of marriage. I want you to feel comfortable here first. I want you to feel like this is your home, not just a place you're trapped. Catherine turned to look at him, really look at him, studying the earnest expression on his weathered face. He meant what he said, she realized. This wasn't some ploy to get her guard down. He genuinely wanted her to feel safe. That's very kind, she said. And you should call me Catherine, or Kate, which is what my father used to call me. But James, I don't want to draw this out indefinitely either. I came here to start a new life, and I think having clear expectations will make things easier for both of us. Then let's start with the ceremony, James said. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Redemption once a month. He's actually in town this week, which is lucky timing. We could go back tomorrow and make things official. Then we can figure out the rest as we go. Tomorrow, Catherine echoed. It seemed impossibly soon and yet entirely practical. All right, tomorrow. That evening, James prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, apologizing for the plainness of it. Catherine insisted on helping, though she quickly revealed her lack of kitchen skills when she nearly burned the cornbread she attempted to make. James rescued it with good humor, scraping off the worst of the charred bottom and declaring it perfectly edible. My cooking isn't much better, he admitted, as they sat at the table together. I've been living on simple things for years, but I have my mother's old recipe book somewhere. Maybe we can work through it together, figure out some better meals? I'd like that, Catherine said, tearing off a piece of the salvaged cornbread. My mother tried to teach me, but I was always more interested in reading than cooking. I'm afraid I was rather stubborn about it. What did you like to read? James asked. And that simple question opened a conversation that carried them through the meal and into the evening. Catherine told him about the novels she loved, the poetry that moved her, the newspaper articles she devoured about the changing world. James listened intently, asking questions, sharing his own limited reading experiences, mostly practical manuals and the occasional newspaper that made its way to the ranch. I've got some books somewhere, he said, rising to light a lamp as darkness fell. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to anything I have. And the general store in Redemption sometimes gets new stock. We could pick up some books when we go in for the ceremony. They talked until Catherine could barely keep her eyes open, exhausted from the long journey and the emotional weight of the day. James showed her to one of the smaller bedrooms, which he had clearly attempted to clean, though dust still lingered in the corners. He brought up her carpet bag and a pitcher of fresh water, then paused in the doorway. Thank you for coming all this way, he said, for taking a chance on this, on me. I know it took courage. Thank you for being kind, Catherine replied. It makes this much less frightening than I expected. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, wind rattling the windows, the creak of the house settling, Catherine felt something unexpected. Not quite happiness, that seemed too strong a word for circumstances still so uncertain, but perhaps hope. Perhaps the sense that she had made the right choice after all. They rode back to Redemption the next morning, both dressed in their best clothes, though Catherine was painfully aware that her traveling dress was the finest thing she owned, and it was already showing signs of wear. James wore dark trousers and a clean white shirt, his hair still damp from washing. He had shaved carefully, and Catherine found herself noticing the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled at her. The preacher, A weathered man in his 50s named Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony in the small church at the edge of town. There were no guests except for the Reverend's wife, who served as witness and who clucked sympathetically over Catherine's lack of a proper wedding dress. The ceremony itself was brief and somewhat impersonal, but when James slipped a simple gold band onto Catherine's finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, she felt the weight of the commitment settling over her. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Thomas announced, and James leaned in carefully, pressing a chaste kiss to Catherine's lips. It was quick and awkward, both of them clearly uncertain, but his lips were warm and gentle, and Catherine felt her heart skip in her chest. "Mrs. Holloway," James said when they stepped out into the bright sunlight, trying out the name. "How does it sound?" "Strange," Catherine admitted, "but I suppose I'll get used to it. Catherine Holloway, Kate Holloway." She tested the variations, rolling them around on her tongue. "Yes, I think I can become used to it." They stopped at the general store where James insisted on buying supplies, including 3 books that Catherine admired, a collection of poetry, a novel about the frontier, and a practical guide to household management that the shopkeeper recommended. He also purchased fabric, several yards of blue cotton and green calico, suggesting that Catherine might want to make some new dresses more suited to ranch life. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a seamstress either," Catherine confessed as they loaded the supplies into the wagon. "I can do basic mending, but making a whole dress from scratch might be beyond my abilities." "Then we'll figure it out together," James said, echoing his words from the day before. "Or maybe there's a woman in town who does sewing and could teach you. We don't have to solve everything immediately." The ride back to the ranch felt different now. They were married, legally bound, and the weight of that hung between them even as they maintained easy conversation. James pointed out more features of the land, showed her where he planned to expand the herd, talked about his hopes for the ranch's future. Catherine listened and asked questions, genuinely interested in understanding this new world she had entered. That evening, after another simple meal that they prepared together with slightly better results, they found themselves standing awkwardly in the main room as the sun set and darkness crept across the prairie. The unspoken question hung between them. Where would they sleep, and what would happen in those sleeping arrangements? "Kate," James said finally, using her nickname for the first time, "I meant what I said about taking time. We're married now, legally and in the eyes of God, but that doesn't mean we have to rush into everything. If you'd prefer to continue sleeping separately until you feel more comfortable, I understand." Catherine twisted the gold ring on her finger, considering. Part of her wanted to take him up on the offer, to retreat to the safety of the small bedroom and postpone the inevitable. But another part, the part that had been brave enough to travel across the country to marry a stranger, wanted to move forward. "I think it would be easier if we didn't drag things out," she said quietly. "I'm nervous. I won't pretend I'm not. But you've been nothing but kind to me, and I trust that you'll continue to be so. Perhaps we could share the main bedroom and see how things unfold naturally." James looked at her with something like admiration. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for," he said. "All right, but Kate, if at any point you're uncomfortable, you need to tell me. I won't be offended and I won't be angry. I'd rather go slow than have you frightened of me." "I'm not frightened of you," Catherine said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. She was nervous about the situation, about her own inexperience, about the physical intimacy that marriage implied, but she wasn't frightened of James himself. In just 2 days, he had shown her more respect and consideration than many men she had known in Boston had managed in years. They climbed the stairs together, and Catherine changed into her nightgown in the privacy of the room while James waited outside. When she called that she was ready, he entered and began his own preparations for bed, moving about the room with careful consideration for her presence. Catherine slipped beneath the quilt on one side of the large bed, her heart pounding, and watched as James extinguished all but one lamp before joining her. The bed dipped under his weight, and Catherine was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his body, the sound of his breathing. For a long moment neither of them moved, Then James turned toward her, propping himself up on one elbow. "Kate," he said softly, "may I kiss you? Properly, I mean, not like the quick thing in church." Catherine's mouth went dry, but she nodded. "Yes." James leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Catherine held still, and when his lips met hers, she was surprised by the gentleness of it. His hand came up to cup her face, his rough palm surprisingly tender against her cheek, and he kissed her with careful attention, as if learning the shape of her mouth. Catherine found herself responding, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing a bit harder, James rested his forehead against hers. "Was that all right?" "It was more than all right," Catherine whispered. "It was lovely." They kissed again, longer this time, with more confidence on both sides. James's hand slid into her hair, loosening the pins she had secured before bed, and Catherine made a small sound of surprise and pleasure as the mass of dark waves tumbled down around her shoulders. "You have beautiful hair," James murmured against her lips. "I noticed it yesterday but didn't want to say anything and seem forward." "You can say things like that now," Catherine said, emboldened by the darkness and the intimacy of the moment. "We're married. I think we're allowed to notice such things about each other." "Then I'll tell you that I think you're lovely," James said. "Not just your hair, all of you. I felt like the luckiest man alive when you stepped off that stagecoach and turned out to be even prettier than I imagined from your letter." Catherine felt heat rising to her cheeks. "You're quite handsome yourself," she admitted. "I was worried you might be, well, older or unkind looking, but you're neither of those things." What followed was tender and careful, James guiding them both through intimacy with patience and attention to Catherine's comfort. He checked in with her frequently, asked if she was all right, adjusted when she expressed uncertainty. Catherine discovered that while the physical aspects of marriage were indeed as awkward and strange as she had been led to believe by her mother's vague warnings, they were also surprisingly pleasant when undertaken with someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. By the time they finally settled into sleep, Catherine curled against James's side with his arm wrapped around her. She felt fundamentally changed. Not just legally married now, but truly beginning to be bound to this man in ways that went beyond signatures on a certificate. The next weeks unfolded in a pattern of small discoveries and shared learning. James taught Catherine to ride, starting with Gentle Daisy as promised. Catherine proved to be a capable student once she overcame her initial nervousness, and within a week she could manage basic riding well enough to accompany James on short trips around the ranch. She loved the freedom of it, the ability to move across the landscape under her own power, the wind in her face, and the horse responding to her commands. In turn, Catherine began tackling the house, which desperately needed a woman's organization. She cleaned thoroughly, scrubbing floors and windows, beating dust from curtains, and organizing the chaotic kitchen cabinets into something approaching logical order. James watched her work with appreciation, helping when he could between his own ranch duties. Together they worked through his mother's recipe book, attempting dishes that sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed spectacularly. The bread Catherine baked rose beautifully one day and came out dense as a brick the next. A stew she attempted was oversalted to the point of being inedible, but the next week's version turned out rich and flavorful. "We're improving," James declared after a particularly successful dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables from the garden Catherine had begun rehabilitating. "At this rate, we'll be competent adults by next year." Catherine laughed, the sound coming more easily now than it had in those first nervous days. "I think competence might be too ambitious. Perhaps we should aim for not starving." "Already achieved," James said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I'd say we're doing pretty well considering." The physical intimacy between them grew more comfortable as well. They learned each other's bodies and preferences, discovered what brought pleasure and what caused discomfort. James remained consistently attentive and patient, and Catherine found herself initiating contact more frequently, reaching for him in the night or stealing kisses when he came in from working with the cattle. They developed small rituals, morning coffee shared while watching the sun rise from the porch, evening conversations by lamplight before bed, James reading aloud while Catherine mended clothes or worked on her sewing. About a month into their marriage, a neighboring rancher and his wife came calling. Henry and Margaret Peterson owned land to the east, and Margaret wasted no time in taking Catherine under her wing. She was a robust woman in her 40s with 5 children ranging from teenagers to toddlers, and she swept into Catherine's kitchen with the confidence of someone who had been managing a frontier household for decades. "Let me show you how to properly preserve vegetables," Margaret declared, surveying Catherine's tentative attempts at pickling. "You'll need to put up food for winter, and what you've got here won't last a week. Come, we'll start with the beans." Catherine found herself grateful for Margaret's somewhat overbearing help. The older woman showed her practical skills that made ranch life manageable. How to render lard, how to make soap, how to manage the enormous task of laundry without modern conveniences. Margaret also provided companionship, another woman to talk to in the vast masculine world of ranching. She invited Catherine to a quilting circle that met monthly in Redemption, introducing her to other ranch wives and homesteader women who welcomed the newcomer with varying degrees of warmth. Through these women, Catherine began to understand the reality of frontier life for wives. Many of them had come west as mail-order brides or following husbands who sought opportunity. They spoke of hard winters and difficult births, of loneliness and back-breaking work, but also of love found in unexpected places and the satisfaction of building something lasting. Catherine listened to their stories and felt less alone in her own adjustment. Summer faded into autumn, and the ranch work intensified. James hired 2 hands for the fall cattle drive, taking a portion of the herd to market in Helena. He was reluctant to leave Catherine alone, but she insisted she would manage fine for the week he would be gone. "I have the vegetable garden to finish harvesting, and Margaret said she would check on me," Catherine assured him. "Besides, I've learned to shoot that rifle you insisted on teaching me. I'll be perfectly safe." The rifle lessons had been James's idea after a neighboring ranch reported trouble with bandits passing through. Catherine had been resistant at first, uncomfortable with the weapon, but James had been patient and insistent. "I need to know you can protect yourself if necessary," he had said, "not because I think you're incapable, but because this is wild country and unpredictable things happen." Now Catherine stood on the porch and watched James and his hired hands drive the cattle toward the horizon, feeling unexpectedly lonely. In just a few months, she had grown so accustomed to James's presence that his absence felt like a missing piece. She kept busy during the days, following through on her plans to finish the harvest and working on a quilt with fabric scraps Margaret had provided. But the evenings were long and quiet, and she found herself sleeping poorly in the big bed alone. On the 4th night of James's absence, Catherine woke to the sound of horses in the yard. She sat up quickly, heart pounding, and moved to the window to peer out. In the moonlight, she could see 3 men dismounting near the barn, moving with the casual confidence of people who believed themselves unobserved. Bandits, she thought immediately, or rustlers looking for easy pickings while they knew the rancher was away. Catherine's hands shook as she pulled on her robe and retrieved the rifle from where James had left it loaded by the bedroom door. She crept downstairs, mind racing. Should she confront them? Fire a warning shot? Her mouth was dry with fear, but anger rose up alongside it. This was her home, hers and James's, and she would not let it be violated without resistance. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised, and called out in the strongest voice she could muster. "You men there, this is private property and you're not welcome. Get back on your horses and ride out, or I'll shoot." The men froze, then turned to face her. One of them laughed, a mean sound that made Catherine's skin crawl. "Well now, boys, looks like the rancher left his little wife behind. That's mighty unfriendly, ma'am, turning away travelers looking for a place to rest." "I said leave," Catherine repeated, her finger hovering near the trigger the way James had taught her. "I mean it." "Why don't you put that rifle down before you hurt yourself?" another man said, starting to walk toward the porch. "We don't want any trouble. We just want to see what supplies you might be willing to share." Catherine fired, aiming high as James had instructed if she ever needed to give a warning. The crack of the rifle split the night air, and the men jumped back. "The next shot won't be high," Catherine said, her voice steadier now despite her racing heart. "Leave, now." For a tense moment, the men seemed to consider their options. Then the third one, who hadn't yet spoken, spat on the ground and said, "Not worth it. Come on, let's find easier pickings elsewhere." They mounted their horses and rode off, and Catherine stood on the porch until they disappeared from view, the rifle trembling in her hands. Only then did she allow herself to sink down onto the porch steps, adrenaline making her shake so badly she had to set the rifle carefully aside. She had done it. She had protected the ranch, but the reality of how differently things could have gone made her feel sick. When James returned 3 days later, dusty and tired, but with money from the successful cattle sale, Catherine fell into his arms with more force than she intended. "Hey," he said, alarmed by her intensity. "Kate, what happened? Are you all right?" She told him about the men trying to downplay her fear, but James's face went hard as he listened. "You did exactly right," he said when she finished. "I'm so damn proud of you, and so grateful you're safe." He held her tightly, and Catherine could feel the tension in his body, the fear he was processing retrospectively. "I hated leaving you alone. I won't do it again, not for trips that long." "I managed," Catherine said, but she was secretly relieved by his words. "But I'll admit I prefer having you here." "I prefer being here with you," James said, pulling back to look at her face. "Kate, these months with you, they've been the best of my life. I know we started this as an arrangement, a practical solution to both our problems. But somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Completely. I should have said it before, but I was afraid it was too soon, or that you didn't feel the same way." Catherine's breath caught. They had been tender with each other, affectionate, growing steadily closer. But neither had spoken of love, as if saying the word would make their arrangement too real, too vulnerable. "I love you too," she said, the words tumbling out. "I think I started falling the first day when you said we would learn together. You've been so patient with me, so kind. I never expected to find this kind of happiness." James kissed her then, deep and fervent, and Catherine responded with equal intensity, pouring months of growing feeling into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go inside," he said. "I've been thinking about being home with you for a week straight, and now I don't want to wait another moment." That night was different from the careful, exploratory intimacy of their early marriage. They came together with passion and confidence, knowing each other's bodies well now, understanding what brought pleasure. Catherine felt cherished and desired, and she gave herself over to the experience completely, crying out James's name as waves of sensation overtook her. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the sheets, she traced patterns on his chest and marveled at how much her life had changed. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "When I left Boston, I thought I was heading toward a practical arrangement, something bearable at best. I never thought I'd find genuine love." "I prayed for it," James admitted. "When I decided to advertise for a wife, I told myself I just needed help with the ranch, someone to share the work. But deep down, I was hoping for more. Hoping for you, even though I didn't know it would be you specifically." Winter came to Montana with a vengeance, snow piling deep and temperatures plunging well below freezing. Catherine learned to manage the challenges of cold weather ranching, hauling water that threatened to freeze, keeping the house warm with endless fires, cooking hearty meals to sustain them through the work of breaking ice in troughs and checking on cattle in the bitter conditions. James taught her to snowshoe so she could move around the property when the snow got too deep for easy walking, and they worked as a seamless team, anticipating each other's needs and supporting each other through the difficult days. Christmas approached, and Catherine felt a pang of homesickness for the first time in months. In Boston, her family had celebrated with a tree and gifts, special meals, and church services. She mentioned this to James one evening, not as a complaint, but simply as a wistful observation. 2 days later, James came into the house dragging a small pine tree he had cut from the stand near the creek. "I thought we could decorate it," he said, grinning at Catherine's surprised delight. "Start our own traditions." They strung popcorn and made paper decorations, and Catherine sewed small sachets of dried herbs from the garden to hang on the branches. On Christmas morning, James presented her with a beautiful shawl he had purchased in Helena, soft wool dyed a deep blue. Catherine gave him a shirt she had laboriously sewn, her stitching improving but still somewhat uneven. James declared it the finest shirt he had ever owned and wore it immediately. They spent Christmas Day together, just the two of them, cooking a special meal and talking about their hopes for the coming year. "I want to expand the horse breeding," James said. "I think there's real potential in it. And maybe we could add some chickens in the spring. Fresh eggs would be useful." "I'd like to expand the garden," Catherine added. "And I've been thinking about trying to write again. I used to keep journals and write little stories before my parents died. Maybe I could start that up again." "I'd like to read your stories," James said, "if you'd be willing to share them." That night, lying in bed with James's arm around her, Catherine reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been living in Boston, her future uncertain and frightening. Now she was in Montana territory, married to a man she loved deeply, building a life that felt meaningful and rich despite its challenges. She fell asleep feeling profoundly grateful. Winter gave way to spring, and with the thaw came new life. Catherine discovered she was pregnant in late March, her monthly cycle absent and morning sickness confirming what she had begun to suspect. She told James one evening after dinner, nervous about his reaction despite knowing he had mentioned wanting a family. "I think I'm expecting a child," she said quietly. "I haven't seen a doctor yet, but all the signs are there." James's face transformed with joy. He jumped up from the table and swept Catherine into his arms, spinning her carefully before setting her down and dropping to his knees to press his ear against her still flat stomach. "A baby?" he said, wonder in his voice. "Kate, we're going to have a baby." "You're pleased?" Catherine asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Pleased? I'm overjoyed, terrified, but overjoyed." James stood and cupped her face in his hands. "You're going to be an amazing mother, and I'm going to do everything I can to be a good father." They told Margaret and Henry at the next opportunity, and Margaret immediately began offering advice and reassurance. "First babies are always nerve-wracking," she said, patting Catherine's hand, "but you're strong and healthy, you'll do fine, and I'll be here to help when your time comes." The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer. Catherine continued to work, though James grew increasingly protective, trying to limit how much heavy lifting or difficult chores she took on. They argued about it good-naturedly, Catherine insisting she was pregnant, not fragile, while James worried about her overexerting herself. Margaret refereed, telling James to let Catherine do what felt comfortable and telling Catherine to accept help when it was offered. In late summer, they made a trip to Redemption to purchase supplies for the coming baby. Catherine selected fabric for diapers and tiny gowns, and James commissioned a cradle from the town's carpenter, designed with careful attention to every detail. They were loading the wagon when a commotion erupted down the street. A woman was screaming, and people were running toward the bank. James immediately moved to shield Catherine, but they could see what was happening. 3 men on horses were fleeing from the bank, guns drawn, saddlebags presumably stuffed with stolen money. The sheriff and several deputized townsmen were mounting horses to give chase, but the robbers had a significant head start. "Inside now," James said, guiding Catherine toward the general store. They took shelter with a dozen other people while the sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance. Catherine pressed her hands protectively over her rounded belly, heart racing. This was the violence of the frontier that usually felt distant from their ranch life, but here it was, immediate and frightening. The robbers escaped, it turned out, heading into the mountains where pursuit would be difficult. One of the deputies had been wounded in the chase, but would survive. The town buzzed with agitation for hours afterward, men gathering in angry clusters to discuss forming a larger posse, women herding children to safety and checking on neighbors. James kept Catherine close, and they finished their business quickly before heading back to the ranch. "Does that happen often?" Catherine asked as they drove home, still shaken. "Not often, but it happens," James said grimly. "The territory is getting more settled, but there are still plenty of lawless men who think they can take what they want. It's one of the reasons I wanted you to learn to shoot. I need to know you can defend yourself and our child if it ever comes to that." Catherine placed her hand over her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "I will protect our family," she said quietly, "whatever it takes." As autumn arrived again, marking more than a year since Catherine had arrived in Montana, they prepared for the baby's arrival. The cradle sat ready in the main bedroom, lined with soft blankets Catherine had sewn. Margaret had shown her how to make diapers and tiny shirts, and Catherine had spent many evenings working on these preparations while James read aloud or worked on ranch accounts at the table. The baby came on a cool October night, arriving after hours of labor that left Catherine exhausted but exhilarated. Margaret attended the birth, coaching Catherine through the pain and the pushing, while James paced downstairs until Margaret finally called him up to meet his son. James cried when he held the tiny boy, tears streaming down his weathered face as he cradled the infant with infinite gentleness. "He's perfect," James whispered. "Kate, he's absolutely perfect. You did this. You're incredible." They named him Thomas Henry Holloway, Thomas after James's father and Henry after their helpful neighbor. The baby was healthy and strong, with dark hair like both his parents and lungs that proved powerful during his nighttime crying sessions. Catherine and James stumbled through early parenthood with the same approach they had taken to marriage and ranching, learning together, making mistakes, supporting each other through the exhaustion and the wonder. Margaret proved invaluable during those first weeks, showing up with meals and advice, reassuring Catherine when she panicked about whether the baby was feeding properly or sleeping enough. "You're doing fine," Margaret would say firmly. "Every new mother worries, but look at him. He's thriving." James was a devoted father, taking turns walking the baby when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, sitting with Thomas cradled against his chest while Catherine caught precious hours of sleep. He rigged up a sling so Catherine could carry the baby while doing lighter chores, and he took on even more of the household work to spare her energy for recovery and feeding. As winter approached again, Catherine reflected on how much had changed since that first winter of their marriage. Then, they had been two people learning to live together, building something from scratch. Now they were a family, bound not just by legal ties and physical intimacy, but by the profound shared experience of creating and caring for a new life. She loved James more deeply than she had thought possible, not just as a husband, but as a partner and father, someone who consistently proved himself through action rather than just words. Thomas grew quickly through that second winter, becoming more alert and interactive. He smiled at his parents, made happy sounds when James played with him, nursed contentedly in Catherine's arms. The work of managing the ranch alongside parenting was exhausting, but Catherine found it deeply fulfilling in ways her old life in Boston never had been. She had purpose here, multiple roles that challenged her and brought meaning to her days. In the spring, James finally got his chickens, building a sturdy coop and acquiring 24 hens and a rooster. Catherine took charge of the chicken operation, teaching herself from a book they had purchased and trial and error. The fresh eggs were a luxury they had missed, and she began experimenting with baking more elaborate desserts and breakfast dishes now that ingredients were readily available. Thomas took his first steps in the summer, lurching across the main room into his father's waiting arms while Catherine clapped and cheered. James swooped the boy up, tossing him gently into the air and making him shriek with delight. Watching them together, Catherine felt her heart might burst with love for both of them. That fall, the ranch had its best year yet. The cattle herd had grown through careful management and strategic purchases, and the horses James had been breeding sold for good prices. They had money to invest back into the property and to save for the future. James hired a permanent hand, a young man named David who was reliable and hardworking. taking some of the daily burden off James's shoulders. With slightly more help, Catherine found time to return to her writing. She began with journal entries documenting their daily life, but gradually moved into trying her hand at stories again. She wrote about the frontier, about the women she had met through Margaret's quilting circle, about the challenges and triumphs of building a life in wild country. James read everything she wrote and encouraged her to send some pieces to newspapers. Catherine was hesitant, but eventually she submitted an essay about her experience as a mail-order bride to a regional paper. To her shock and delight, they published it, paying her a small sum and printing her words for dozens of readers. "You're a published writer," James said proudly, reading the newspaper for the third time. "Kate, this is wonderful. You should keep submitting things." Catherine did, writing more essays and even attempting a serialized story. Not everything she wrote found a publisher, but enough did that she began to develop a modest reputation. Women wrote letters responding to her essays, sharing their own experiences, thanking her for giving voice to the realities of frontier wifedom. Catherine answered these letters carefully, building connections and finding community in unexpected ways. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler who wanted to be involved in everything his parents did. James fashioned a small, child-sized cowboy hat for him, and Thomas wore it constantly, following his father around the ranch property and helping with chores in the adorably ineffective way of small children. Catherine captured these moments in her journal, knowing that someday she would want to remember exactly how Thomas had looked at 2 years old, chasing chickens and trying to imitate his father's bow-legged walk. When Thomas was 3, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy felt different from the first, partially because she knew what to expect, and partially because she was juggling toddler care alongside the nausea and fatigue. James stepped up even more, taking Thomas on longer outings to give Catherine time to rest, and Margaret once again provided crucial support and advice. The second baby arrived in early spring, a daughter they named Eleanor Rose, Eleanor after Catherine's mother, and Rose because she was born just as the wild roses began blooming around the ranch. She had Catherine's features, but James's dark eyes, and Thomas was fascinated by his tiny sister, wanting to touch her constantly and bring her his toys. "Gentle," Catherine reminded him over and over, guiding his small hands to pat Eleanor's back softly. "She's very little and fragile." "My baby," Thomas declared possessively. And while Catherine and James corrected him that Eleanor was their baby, his sister, not his personal possession, they were charmed by his protective instinct. With 2 children, life became even more complex and demanding. Catherine sometimes felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work involved in keeping everyone fed, clothed, clean, and safe. But James never failed to tell her how much he appreciated her, to take on his share and more of the parenting duties, to remind her on difficult days how far they had both come from those uncertain beginnings. "Remember when you told me you didn't know how to be a wife?" he said one evening as they sat on the porch, Thomas asleep against James's shoulder and Eleanor nursing in Catherine's arms. "You thought you couldn't manage any of this." "I remember," Catherine said, smiling at the memory of her younger, more fearful self. "And you said we would learn together every day." "We have," James said. "And we're still learning. But Kate, look at what we've built. This family, this life. You're an amazing wife and mother. I hope you know that." "You're a wonderful husband and father," Catherine replied. "I couldn't imagine doing any of this without you. You're my partner in the truest sense." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Montana prairie. The same vast landscape that had seemed so overwhelming and foreign when Catherine first arrived. Now it was home, as familiar and beloved as the man beside her and the children in their arms. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and joys. The ranch prospered, allowing James to purchase additional land and expand operations. Catherine's writing brought in supplemental income and personal fulfillment, and she eventually compiled some of her essays into a small book that a publisher back east agreed to print. It sold modestly but steadily, finding an audience among women curious about frontier life. Thomas and Eleanor grew, joined eventually by another brother, James Jr., born when Thomas was 6. The house that had once seemed too large for just Catherine and James now rang with the sounds of children, laughter and arguments, tears and games. Catherine sometimes felt exhausted beyond measure, but she was also happier than she had ever imagined possible. Margaret remained a close friend as the years passed, her own children growing and starting families of their own. The quilting circle continued, and Catherine became one of the experienced women welcoming newcomers and offering advice. She thought often of how lost she had felt in those early days and tried to ease the path for other women making similar transitions. When Thomas was 10, Eleanor 7, and James Jr. 4, Catherine stood at the stove one morning making breakfast while James helped the children get ready for their day. Thomas was now old enough to help seriously with ranch work, shadowing his father with genuine usefulness rather than toddler mimicry. Eleanor was proving to be artistically talented, always drawing and painting pictures of the ranch and its animals. James Jr. was still young enough to be primarily concerned with playing and eating, though he showed signs of his father's gentle temperament. James came up behind Catherine and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway." "Good morning yourself," Catherine said, leaning back against him. "Are the children ready for breakfast?" "Almost. Eleanor is fixing James's shirt buttons and Thomas is putting on his boots." James pressed a kiss to Catherine's neck. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" "You told me last night," Catherine said, smiling, "and the night before, but I'll never tire of hearing it." "Good, because I plan to keep saying it for the next 50 years at least." Breakfast was its usual controlled chaos. Children chattering over each other, milk nearly getting spilled, James refereeing disputes about who got which chair. Catherine watched it all with deep contentment. This was her life now, built from that frightening leap of faith she had taken at 22 when she stepped off the stagecoach into an uncertain future. After breakfast, James went out to work with Thomas while Eleanor helped Catherine with the dishes, and James Jr. played with wooden blocks on the floor. Catherine found herself thinking about that first conversation with James, when she had admitted her fears and inadequacies, and he had responded with such unexpected grace and patience. "Mama, why are you smiling?" Eleanor asked, looking up from the dish she was drying. "I'm just happy," Catherine said, "thinking about how lucky I am." "Lucky to have us?" Eleanor asked with a child's self-centeredness. "Yes, lucky to have you," Catherine confirmed, "and lucky to have your father, lucky to be here in this place, living this life." That afternoon, Catherine took time to write. She had been working on a longer piece, something between memoir and fiction, about a woman who traveled west to marry a stranger and found unexpected love and purpose. The writing came easily, informed by her own experience but shaped into something more universal, something that might speak to anyone who had ever taken a risk in search of a better life. She was deep in the work when James came in, dusty from the fields, Thomas trailing behind him. "We're breaking for the day," and James announced. "Thought maybe we could all go down to the creek for a swim before dinner. It's hot enough." The family spent the late afternoon at the creek, James and Thomas teaching James Jr. to swim while Eleanor waded carefully and Catherine watched from the bank, occasionally joining them in the cool water. These were the moments Catherine treasured most. The ordinary family time that was actually extraordinary in its happiness and simplicity. That evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine and James sat on the porch, as they had countless times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any city lights, spread across the vast Montana sky. James held Catherine's hand, their fingers intertwined with the ease of long practice. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Advertising for a wife instead of courting someone local, someone you could have known before committing?" James considered the question seriously. "Never," he said finally. "I won't pretend I knew it would work out this well. I was taking a chance, same as you were. But Kate, you're the best thing that ever happened to me, you and the children. This family we've built together, I wouldn't change any of it." "Neither would I," Catherine said. "It's strange to think how frightened I was that first day, how uncertain. I felt like I was stepping off a cliff into nothing." "You were brave," James said. "Braver than you knew." coming all this way to marry someone you had only corresponded with, trusting that it would work out somehow. You made it easy, Catherine said. From that first conversation when you said we would learn together every day, you made me feel like I didn't have to be perfect, like I could make mistakes and still be valued. We both made mistakes, James reminded her. Remember that first month when I tried to do laundry and turned all our clothes pink with that red shirt? Catherine laughed at the memory. Or when I tried to make preserves and they all exploded in the cellar. We learned, James said, echoing those words from years ago. We're still learning, and we'll keep learning together for the rest of our lives. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle settling, an owl hooting in the distance, the rustle of wind through grass. Catherine thought about how far they had both come, not just in practical skills, but in emotional growth. They had learned to communicate, to support each other, to build a partnership that went far beyond the legal contract of marriage. As the years continued to pass, the Holloway family became an established part of the Redemption community. James served on the town council, helping make decisions about development and services. Catherine's writing gained a wider audience, and she was asked to speak at gatherings of women's groups, sharing her experiences and encouraging others to find their own voices. Their children grew into capable, kind young people who reflected the love and care their parents had invested in them. Thomas eventually took over more of the ranch management, proving to have inherited his father's skill with animals and land. Eleanor pursued her artistic talents, selling paintings to people across the territory and eventually back east. James Jr. showed an interest in veterinary medicine, a relatively new field, and they supported his education and ambitions. Through all the changes and challenges, Catherine and James remained deeply connected. They had grown together rather than apart, their initial attraction and respect maturing into a profound love that sustained them through difficult times and made good times even sweeter. They celebrated anniversaries with the same attention they gave to their children's birthdays and holidays, marking each year as a milestone worth honoring. On their 20th anniversary, James commissioned a formal photograph of the family. They all dressed in their best clothes and went to the photographer's studio in Redemption, which now boasted such modern conveniences. The resulting image captured them all. James and Catherine seated in the center with Thomas, Eleanor, and James Jr. standing behind them, everyone looking proud and happy. Catherine had the photograph framed and hung it prominently in their parlor, a testament to everything they had built. 20 years, James said that night as they prepared for bed. Can you believe it? Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, Catherine said, and sometimes it feels like yesterday that I stepped off that stagecoach, terrified and trying not to show it. You showed it a little, James admitted with a smile, but I was terrified too, worried you would take one look at me and get back on the stagecoach. That never crossed my mind, Catherine said. From the moment you spoke to me, I felt like maybe things would be all right, and I was correct. They made love that night with the practiced ease of long intimacy, knowing exactly how to please each other, the physical connection still strong after 2 decades. Afterwards, lying in the darkness, Catherine reflected on how marriage had evolved for them. That initial nervousness and exploration had given way to comfort and confidence, but they had never let the relationship become merely routine. They still made time for each other, still said, "I love you" daily, still treated their partnership as something precious worth nurturing. As they moved into their 50s, with their children grown and starting families of their own, Catherine and James found themselves with more time for each other again. Thomas had married a local girl and was running the ranch largely independently now, though he and his wife lived in a house they had built on the property. Eleanor had married an artist she met in Helena and was raising her own family while continuing to paint. James Jr. had completed his veterinary training and opened a practice in Redemption, serving the needs of ranchers and farmers across the territory. Catherine continued to write, now working on her 3rd book, a novel based loosely on the experiences of women she had met over the years. James had eased back from the most physically demanding ranch work, though he remained active and involved in operations. They took more time for leisure, riding out across the prairie together as they had in those early days when Catherine was first learning to ride, sitting on the porch in the evenings, traveling occasionally to visit their children and grandchildren. "We did it," Catherine said one evening, as they watched the sunset from their favorite spot on the porch. "We built a good life. We raised good children. We loved each other well." "We're still doing it," James corrected gently. "Still building, still loving. This isn't past tense yet, Kate." "You're right," Catherine said, squeezing his hand. "And I'm glad. I'm not ready to be done living this life with you." They celebrated their 25th anniversary with a party that brought together their whole extended family and many friends from the community. Margaret and Henry were there, both now grandparents themselves multiple times over. The house and yard filled with people, laughter, children running and playing, food covering every available surface. Catherine looked around at the celebration and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," she said to James when they had a moment alone. "For everything, for being patient with me when I didn't know what I was doing, for being a true partner, for loving me so completely." "Thank you for taking a chance on me," James replied, "for being brave enough to come west, for learning alongside me, for giving me this family and this life. I love you more than I can express, Kate." As the party continued around them, they stood together, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. Two people who had started as strangers and become the most important person in each other's world. They had learned together every day, just as James had promised in those frightening early moments of their marriage. They had stumbled and made mistakes, had moments of frustration and confusion, but they had always come back to that fundamental commitment to figure things out together. Years later, as they entered their 60s, Catherine looked back on her life with deep satisfaction. She had published 4 books, raised 3 children who had become wonderful adults, helped build a successful ranch, and most importantly, loved and been loved by a man who never failed to treat her with respect and tenderness. The fears of that young woman stepping off the stagecoach seemed almost quaint now, the worry that she wouldn't know how to be a wife laughable in retrospect. She had learned to be a wife, just as James had learned to be a husband. They had learned to be parents together, to be partners, to be friends and lovers and companions. They had built something lasting and beautiful out of an arrangement that had started with more hope than certainty. One warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Catherine said, "Do you remember what I told you that first day? That I didn't know how to be a wife?" "I remember," James said, "and I remember what I told you, that we would learn together every day." "We did," Catherine said softly. "We really did. Every single day for all these years we learned together how to love each other, how to build a life, how to face challenges and celebrate victories. We're still learning, I suppose." "Always learning," James agreed. "That's what makes it interesting. After 30 years, you still surprise me sometimes, still teach me new things about love and partnership." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Catherine felt the same sense of belonging she had felt increasingly over the decades since her arrival. This was her home. Not just the physical ranch, but the life she shared with James, the family they had created, the community they were part of. She had found her place in the world, and it was more wonderful than she ever could have imagined during those frightening days when she first contemplated answering a matrimonial advertisement. Thomas came over with his 2 children, and Eleanor arrived with her family shortly after, bringing James Jr. and his wife. The porch and yard filled with family, 3 generations of Holloways gathered together. Catherine watched James with the grandchildren, his patience with them infinite, his joy in their presence clear on his weathered face. He caught her watching and smiled, that same warm smile that had helped put her at ease during their first awkward conversations. Later, after everyone had left and they were preparing for bed, James pulled Catherine into his arms. "Happy?" he asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "Profoundly happy," Catherine confirmed. "I have everything I could possibly want. A man I love who loves me back, children and grandchildren who are healthy and happy, work that fulfills me, friends who support me. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," James agreed. "We've been blessed, you and I. We took a chance on each other, and it paid off beyond what either of us could have hoped. They made love that night with the tender passion of long-married couples, their bodies aged but still responsive to each other, still capable of bringing and receiving pleasure. Catherine thought, as she often did during these intimate moments, how grateful she was that James had been the one to answer her correspondence, that fate or chance or divine providence had brought them together. She couldn't imagine her life with anyone else. As they drifted towards sleep, Catherine said drowsily, "I love you, James Holloway, today and tomorrow, and every day after that for as long as we have together." "I love you, Catherine Holloway," James replied, his arms tightening around her. "My wife, my partner, my greatest blessing. We'll keep learning together every day for all the days we have left." The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and James and Catherine settled into a comfortable routine in their later years. They still helped where they could, but had earned the right to ease back and enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard work. Catherine published a final book, a memoir of her years in Montana that became her most successful work, resonating with readers who were fascinated by frontier life and genuine love stories. James remained active in the community, serving as an elder statesman whose wisdom was sought on matters ranging from ranching practices to civic development. Their children remained close, visiting frequently with the grandchildren who adored their grandfather's stories and their grandmother's baking. Catherine had finally mastered cooking and baking after years of practice, and her kitchen had become a gathering place for family celebrations. She particularly loved making sugar cookies with the grandchildren, teaching them to roll dough and use cookie cutters, flour dusting everyone, and laughter filling the kitchen. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered again for a massive celebration. Catherine wore a new dress for the occasion, deep blue like the one she had worn when she first arrived in Montana, though this one was much finer and better fitted. James wore a suit that made him look distinguished, his hair now more silver than dark, but his eyes still bright and warm when they looked at his wife. 40 years, Catherine said during the celebration, standing beside James as they addressed their assembled family and friends. "When I came to Montana Territory in 1876, I was terrified. I had agreed to marry a man I had never met, to live a life I knew nothing about in a place that seemed impossibly wild and foreign. I didn't know how to be a wife, and I was convinced I would fail at everything." She looked at James, who was smiling at her with undisguised affection. "But this man, he told me something that changed everything. He said we would learn together every day, and we have. We've learned how to love each other, how to build a home and raise a family, how to weather storms, both literal and metaphorical. We've learned that partnership means supporting each other through failures and celebrating each other's successes. We've learned that marriage is not about being perfect, but about being present, about showing up for each other day after day, year after year." James took her hand, raising it to his lips to kiss her knuckles. "Kate has been the greatest gift of my life," he said. "I prayed for a partner, and God sent me a woman who exceeded every hope and dream I had. She made this house a home. She gave me children and grandchildren who fill my life with joy. She built her own career and made her mark on the world, while still being fully present for our family. She is extraordinary, and I'm grateful for every single day we've had together." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and Catherine felt tears running down her own cheeks. Thomas stood and raised his glass. "To our parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who showed us what real love looks like, who taught us that marriage is work, but the best kind of work, the kind that builds something lasting and beautiful. May we all be as lucky as they have been." Everyone drank to the toast, and the celebration continued long into the evening. Catherine danced with James to music provided by a local fiddle player, her body still fitting perfectly against his after 4 decades. They moved slowly, savoring the moment, aware of how precious these times were as they entered the twilight of their lives. As they drove home that night, the stars brilliant overhead as they had been on so many Montana nights before, Catherine leaned against James's shoulder. Thank you for 40 wonderful years, she said. Thank you for saying yes, James replied, for getting on that stagecoach and traveling across the country to give us a chance, for staying even when things were hard, for loving me as much as I love you. They spent their remaining years in contentment, watching their grandchildren grow and eventually welcoming great-grandchildren. Catherine's books remained in print, introducing new generations of readers to frontier life and genuine romance. James became something of a legend in redemption, the rancher who had built an empire through hard work and integrity, who had loved his wife devotedly for more than 40 years. When James fell ill in his 72nd year, Catherine nursed him with the same devotion he had always shown her. Their children came to visit frequently, and the house was rarely empty of family. On a quiet spring evening, with Catherine holding his hand and their children gathered around, James slipped away peacefully. His last words were, "I love you, Kate. Thank you for learning with me." Catherine grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been blessed with a long life together, with love that never wavered, with family and friends and purposeful work. She continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still writing occasionally, still finding beauty in the Montana landscape she had come to love so deeply. She lived another 8 years, remaining sharp and active until near the end. On the day she died at 80 years old, she was sitting on the porch watching the sunset, that same glorious Montana sunset she had witnessed thousands of times before. Thomas found her there, peaceful and still, a slight smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful in those final moments. At her funeral, Eleanor read from one of Catherine's books, a passage about taking chances and trusting in love, about building a life from nothing but hope and determination. Thomas spoke about his parents' partnership, how they had modeled what marriage should be, how they had loved each other and their children with equal devotion. James Jr. shared memories of his mother's encouragement, of his ambitions, how she had always believed he could accomplish anything he set his mind to. They buried Catherine beside James on a hillside overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their long lives. But their true legacy wasn't in stone. It was in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their values. It was in the ranch that continued to thrive generations later. It was in the books Catherine had written that still inspired readers. It was in the story of their love, which became part of family lore told and retold to each new generation. The story of how Catherine Montgomery stepped off a stagecoach in 1876, terrified but brave, and found James Holloway waiting for her. How she had admitted she didn't know how to be a wife, and he had promised they would learn together every day. How they had kept that promise for more than 40 years, building a life and love that became legendary in its devotion and endurance. It was a story about taking chances and trusting in possibility, about patience and partnership, about two people who started as strangers and became each other's everything through daily choice and commitment. It was a story about the American frontier and the strong people who settled it, but more than that, it was a story about love in its truest, most lasting form. And on that hillside where Catherine and James rested together overlooking the prairie they had worked and loved, their story continued to resonate. Because real love, the kind they had shared, doesn't end with death. It echoes forward through generations, inspiring and uplifting, reminding everyone who hears it that taking a chance on love, even when you're frightened and uncertain, even when you don't know how things will work out, is always worth it in the end. The ranch continued under Thomas's stewardship, and eventually his sons, remaining in the Holloway family for generations. The house where Catherine and James had lived was preserved and eventually turned into a small museum by their great-grandchildren, showcasing frontier life and honoring the remarkable couple who had built their legacy through love and hard work. Catherine's books were rediscovered by scholars studying frontier women's literature, and new editions were published with introductions explaining her significance. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one, that in Redemption, Montana and the surrounding territory, when people spoke of true love and lasting partnership, they still spoke of James and Catherine Holloway. They told the story of the mail-order bride who didn't know how to be a wife, and the cowboy who promised they would learn together every day. And in the telling, they inspired countless others to believe that love, real and lasting love, was worth taking a chance on, worth working for, worth building a life around. Because Catherine and James had proven that marriage wasn't about starting perfect, it was about starting willing, about committing to grow together, about showing up for each other day after day until those days became years and those years became a lifetime. They had shown that the greatest love stories aren't about dramatic gestures or instant perfection. They're about quiet devotion, daily choice, and two people who decide again and again to learn together, to build together, to love together through whatever comes. And so their story lived on, a testament to the power of taking chances, of keeping promises, of learning together every single day. It lived in the land they had worked, in the family they had raised, in the words Catherine had written, and most of all, in the enduring example of what love could be when two people committed themselves fully to building it together. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West of 1876, but timeless in its lessons and inspiration. A love story that began with fear and uncertainty, but ended in profound joy and fulfillment, proving that the best journeys often start with a leap of faith and the simple promise to figure things out together, day by day, until those days become a beautiful lifetime shared.